So clearly, when thinking through the conversation like we want to have in the webinar today, looking at the intersection or the interconnection, complementarities or contradictions associated with inclusive reconstruction, inclusive peacemaking, and political transition processes, clearly complex. To say that it's complex is an understatement. The scale of reconstruction across Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere is simply mind-boggling. The World Bank and UN have estimated that rebuilding across the Middle East will cost between 350 and 650 billion US dollars. Despite the importance of reconstruction in post-conflict settings, the topic has typically been overlooked in many peace processes. Less than a third of peace agreements since 1990 have included provisions on socio-economic development. Fewer still, around 10%, have addressed issues pertaining to reconstruction and infrastructure. This gap may yet become even more pronounced given the decrease in comprehensive peace agreements and with the increase in limited ceasefire or cessation of hostilities agreements, or partial or incomplete political transition processes like we're now seeing unfold in a number of country contexts across the region. As such, the idea of post-conflict reconstruction needs to be reassessed within a changing context of peacemaking and the broader peace and security architecture, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but elsewhere as well. The dynamics outlined raise questions about how reconstruction may contribute to political stability or not. Stability for whom? Who's included? Who is involved? Who influences these reconstruction efforts? Interests, regional interests, and those actors that are involved. Thinking through these kinds of questions, which we very much hope to do in the session today, can also help to unpack the various ways in which reconstruction and peacemaking and political transitions are interconnected. This is particularly the case in a number of contexts across the MENA region, given that reconstruction is set to take place alongside partial, incomplete, or non-existent peace processes, or contested political transition processes. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, actually just from last weekend as we were sending out the invites for this webinar, ironically enough, Maha Yahya asserts that the main obstacle to the Arab world's reconstruction will not be the lack of funds. It will be political disputes and grievances. The region is filled with failing states. It features competing powers that work to leverage this chaos to their geopolitical advantage. Together, these problems make permanent peace impossible. The involvement of regional actors, both in terms of financing reconstruction efforts, but also shaping political transition processes, are inextricably intertwined. Ostensibly, stability and reconstruction can be shared and mutually reinforcing interests. But by focusing on economic development, peace dividends in the absence of meaningful peace may only paper over the cracks and exacerbate inequality in what is already one of the world's most economically unequal out across cityscapes in terms of physical infrastructure and how that mitigates and facilitates interaction between those in power and the people that they ostensibly serve. So there's a bunch of questions that we're trying to unpack today. We have 90 minutes together, so we're not going to be able to get through it all. But I think by bringing Dean, Noura, and Zozan into the space, we really hope to anchor the conversation in their perspectives and their experiences around these issues, and then to draw on the expertise and experience of those in the room as well to really enrich that conversation. So I'll briefly introduce the three speakers, and then I'll hand it over to Dean to kick us off. Dr. Dean Sharp is a visiting fellow in Human Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics and a senior consultant and academic advisor for the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture. As well as contributing to several highly regarded publications, Dr. Sharp has edited 4 books. The first, Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprisings from 2016, Open Gaza, Architectures of Hope from 2022, Reconstruction as Violence in Syria, which is currently to be published, as well as Learning Ecologies in Architecture. he has worked for the UN, governments, and international NGOs. Dr. Noura Chouaibi is an assistant professor of political science at Kuwait University, specializing in GCC and in the book, The Implications of FDI, Women's Rights and Post-Conflict Countries, also forthcoming. In addition to her work in academia, she serves as a moderator for Kuwait's NATO office and has provided instruction and training for the diplomatic corps at the Saud Al Nasser Diplomatic Center in Kuwait. And last but not least, we have Zuzan Alouche, who is an independent political and development consultant and mediator with extensive expertise in political affairs, community development, and conflict mediation. Among other engagements, Ms. Alouche is a member of the Women's Advisory Board to the UN Special Envoy for Syria and served as its chair in 2023. In this capacity, she provides strategic advice on political processes and gender dynamics, ensuring that civil society perspectives are represented in negotiations and peace dialogues. And suffice to say, I think Susan's had a busy few months. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dean to kick us off. And thanks again for taking time to join for the conversation today. Over to you, Dean.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you for having me and for everyone that's online for joining this conversation. This is a vastly complex topic that I've been involved with for nearly 20 years now in the context of Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and Sudan. And there are many different aspects to touch upon, but given the time constraints and the nature of this conversation, I really want to hone down on 4 key points. The first is a global one around the broader urbanization of violence and conflict. It's a global phenomena, but one that has been concentrated within the Arab world. The second point is this untying of reconstruction with post-conflict. This is very much a Western post-War II legacy that is very much embedded in our minds, that is important to untie for reasons that I will get to. And then the third point is around what happens and the importance before construction or reconstruction. As we can see in Gaza, there is the complexities of debris and rubble removal that present profound issues before we can even begin questions of reconstruction, or perhaps we need to rethink in terms of what reconstruction entails and where it begins and where it ends. And finally, just to highlight the absence of clear global principles around reconstruction, about what it is that we're trying to achieve and how and under what conditions. So the first thing is this urbanization of violence and conflict. This is something that is spread. There's quite a rigorous academic debate going on to the extent that this is a real phenomenon that's going on in the world. And 2 points that I would like to make in relation to this scholarly one. The first is to say that it is not just about the increase in incidents within this defined area of the city. So you see a lot of quantitative studies that try and count how many instances have happened in cities to say, has there been a rise? But that misses what is going on, because we have to understand that the way urbanization is happening is radically different from the 1960s and 1970s. Infrastructures are being built on a scale that we haven't seen before. The way that property rights and the financial systems are increasing, the extent and range of our urban context, all in turn has an impact to how conflict and urbanization happens. So these 2 points of conflict getting more complex on the one hand, and urbanization and their intersection. So that's just to say that the urbanization of violence and conflict is happening at pace and is growing in complexity. And it involves new technologies around surveillance systems and AI, as we've also seen in Gaza, the rapid use and quite frightening use of AI technologies to identify individual targets on a mass scale. The militarization and securitization of land is really rapidly changing and again, exceeding on a place. And we're seeing in the Arab region, the scale of destruction really becoming, as Alex was saying in the introduction, really incomprehensible. Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Libya, these are really confronting us in a way that exceeds what we saw perhaps in the Second World War. So the second point is untying this connection between Reconstruction and post-conflict. And that gets to this idea that I've put forward called Reconstruction as violence. So this is part of a book that will come out in the latter part of this year that looked at how the Assad regime, from the very start of the Syrian conflict, weaponized the reconstruction process. He very soon announced a reconstruction mechanism in which laws were changed around property rights, and reconstruction projects were soon announced. So this is also part of the symbolic narrative around reconstruction, but also the material and how it can wipe away oppositional areas. And Assad deemed certain communities oppositional to his rule, so he demarked them as reconstruction areas and subsequently cleared it. So this is how reconstruction can be part of the war. Solidaire, which is another example of a mass reconstruction project that was established following the end of the Lebanese Civil War, that Assad took also great influence from for the Marota city project, for instance, that was designed as kind of joint stock companies. I can't go into this too much because of time limits, but the point here is just to highlight as well the political economy aspects of the war making and the creation of exclusive zones to feed certain social elites, and the importance of space to social processes. The third point then is around debris and rubble before perhaps we get to something called reconstruction. If we look now at Gaza, there's an estimated 10,000 Palestinians whose remains are mixed up in this rubble, are buried there, are decimated there. This needs special teams to identify these remains, to clear it in a humane and dignified way. And on top of that, mixed in with this rubble is toxic materials like asbestos, and of course, unexploded ordinances. Like the complexity here is vast, and not even to get into the sorts of restrictions that come with the occupation and the continued siege on Gaza, where you're restricted from the amount of rubble. So if we look at Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the number of trucks that were allowed in and out were 90 per day. UNDP has quite a good documentation of this. If we think about the scale of rubble in Gaza, and calculated what the rubble removal through 90 trucks a day, I mean, we're talking decades, and some crude calculations have been done on the basis of this. But the point here is also to think about the various elements that constitute a reconstruction phase, and complexities like debris and rubble, where you're faced with toxic materials, unexploded ordinances, and the dignified removal and identification of inhabitants who have been killed. So this leads to finally the fourth point, which is around the lack of any multilateral frameworks that comprehensively deal with the process of reconstruction in all its different complexities. At the moment, they're scattered through various documents that have been done at various times, and usually to specific contexts. The World Bank has one, the Brahimi report included one. It's scattered through various agencies. So in part, this is a very direct call for a UN agency. I would thought that UN Habitat would be a good one, but it could be another agency to take the lead in creating clear guidelines for principles for reconstruction. But secondly, to really highlight, and I think Gaza is a very good illustrative example, where you have Trump's plan, which I think everyone who has a conscience is rightly horrified by, because it's a plan for ethnic cleansing and a clear violation of international law. But the counter proposals by the Arab states equally leave out the Palestinian people themselves. And a recent UN EU World Bank report that has estimated reconstruction to be over 50 billion does quite well lay out its own principles again, of which the first is to ensure that it is a Palestinian-led process that reconnects Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. The crucial point here, though, is to ensure that these reconstruction processes are not simply top-down, that ignore the actual inhabitants themselves that are going to be subject to this reconstruction, who, of course, are the most important element and component of any durable reconstruction plan. Those are 4 brief points and comments, and look forward to this discussion. Thanks. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Dean, for outlining those different parameters and those 4 key considerations. And I think there's a lot of things there to circle back to in the subsequent conversation and discussion. To further add perspectives to that conversation and to this discussion now, over to Dr. Noura Chouaibi.
Thank you, Alex, for bringing us together. It is a very important topic, and I echo Dean's urgency and comments about the complexity of this, topic. I see a lot of people that are involved in one way or another in the audience in reconstruction and post-conflict resolution and what have you, which is very important for us to actually delve and have dialogue as such. So what I wanted to do is echo Dean's comment, but go back, on a general lens at the beginning. There's a point that, Dean, and please correct me if I understood it wrong. You mentioned lack of multilateral framework for comprehensive restructuring, right? And this I agree with, but I think looking at conflict today, the makeup of the countries that are in conflict, let's say in the MENA region, the age of multilateral framework from international organizations is, in a way, is ending. Let me substantiate that comment. I know it's a big allegation or comment to make. So with post-conflict restructuring, right? There was a model that is a traditional model, the way we look at rebuilding states, which is a state building model, right? Utilized in the 90s and 2000s. We see it implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq as so what this state building model is basically at a top bottom approach, right? So it's very elitist. And what it does is it's under the supervision of international organizations, right? So there are interests that bleed into the reconstruction. There are specific ideal ideas of how a post-conflict state should look like. And usually this agenda is mostly aiming at, implementing an open, market economy and a liberal democracy of some sort. When we look at what the cases we have today and how reconstruction should look like, I think we need to abandon this approach and go towards something more of a reparative justice approach. So with a reparative justice approach, it actually involves, it's a grassroots approach, and it's a mix between the elite decision-making and the rest of the people who are affected. So basically, it's a survivor-oriented approach, and it has measures like inclusive reconciliation through education, restitution, and what have you. So especially with the cases in the MENA, well, what we see is that this approach should be the way to go, because everyone on ground who is affected needs to be involved in decision making of rebuilding, right? And it's not the international organizations and the aid that comes in and the limitations and expectations that come, especially with the whole debated idea of democracy. What does democracy mean? How can we implement it here, or what kinds of measures that we can implement? And you cannot basically impose specific norms within a country that does not echo its neighbors, right? Because anything that happens will bleed in. So we need to, with the reconstruction of the MENA region, of countries like Yemen, like Syria, like Lebanon, and Palestine, we need to look at what's around them, right? The countries around them, what is their governance makeup, what their institutions look like, because this all bleeds in and is impacted. This way we can actually look at a more long-term and sustainable stability for the country. So basically we need to challenge the traditional transitional justice mechanism, like trials, truth commissions, and what have you, because they don't really work. With reparative justice, what we need to do is create inclusive societies. So basically, this is when you create platforms to acknowledge harm and wrongdoing to everyone that's impacted. This means you need to involve civic society. This means you need to involve the private sector. You need to involve everyone from everywhere, especially the diaspora as well. So a lot of the countries that we're talking about right now have gone through, failed institutions and distrust in the governance and all that. And this really, resulted in an exodus of people. All of these people actually have gained, they are skilled, they gained knowledge, experience, and what have you in their different countries that they migrated to. So it is very important to have a structure of reparative justice for their country, so they are attracted to come back and be part of the decision-making process. Because then what you're doing is you're attracting the skill set that has left and bled your country dry, and it can come back for rebuilding. What this system does, it basically addresses broader systemic issues that needs, communities and the communities to bring back, to communicate justice, basically, and their vision of what is going on. We can talk about different steps of how we can do that. Basically, in the Middle East, we need to understand that everyone who's involved should not look at restoring the country pre-war, right? Because even pre-war was not an ideal situation. And this is where this traditional set of, hey, do we want stability and just, create some sort of peace where we say there's a lack of war or conflict? Or do we want to actually build a different structure, build a governance that actually works for the country itself, for where it is in the region, and for actors all around it, right? So with countries we're talking about, we shouldn't be looking at what is the pre-war situation, and let's go back to that, because that's not the way to go with restorative justice, right? With the reparative. Basically, we want to neutralize and deal with the causes that led to that war. Causes that led to that war mean that we need to involve everyone, including from all sets of life, right? And this is where the reparative justice comes into place. And then after that, we need to create a new social contract, basically. This social contract should address the vertical injustices, which means social economic disparities, and horizontal inequalities, ethnic, religious, territorial, political, and even tribal. Because doing this, addressing this mechanism this way means that you are localizing the solution, right? You're localizing the state building. And doing it means that it's not a cookie cutter recipe. So each country, because of its social makeup, its economic disparities and all that, will deal itself the way it sees fit, right? With the tools that are available, the skill set that is available. The international organizations, international aid, and international actors should be a support system, right? It is a support system to the local solution that is there in the country. Basically, we need to clearly identify external interests and actors, because rebuilding and reconstruction looks very different depending on each stakeholder, right? The donors look at it differently, and the victims look at it differently, anyone who's impacted look at it differently, and the countries around that war-torn country look at reconstruction very differently. So these are some angles that we need to really look at when we talk about how can we reconstruct war-torn countries to make it more inclusive, to really change that traditional sense of how to rebuild, because we've seen a lot of cases in the past and examples that didn't really work. So we just need to start adopting something. There is no right and wrong answer in this situation. There is really what can work and what doesn't work for the country at stake. So we always need to tackle low-hanging fruit, but we need to always inherently be acknowledging and reconciling, because there are, there are years of years that need to be healed for everyone to actually move on with trust in governance, trust in institutions, because there's a lack of distrust in the MENA region with war-torn countries, basically. The importance of bridging research and practice is really, really, like, I don't know how to explain and express how valuable it is, because everything I mentioned now is really informed by research, right? And even research says that usually countries that have a clear winner and loser in a war tend to fare better in the reconstruction process. So when we know that and we see how research informed this, we can act better in the decision-making process. So the information that I brought forth is basically based on research, right? And observation and what is going on. So bridging that and having localized research groups within the reconstruction process is very important, so you don't keep repeating the same mistake over and over. So for example, when I just mentioned a clear loser and winner, some people might see that and say, well, then just leave the country to its own and see who wins and who loses, and then that's what happens. And some people would see it as, oh, okay, this is a good piece of information to have for us to actually clarify and see how reconciliation happens, because you need to identify the wrongdoing and you need to start healing. So basically, I'm just now I just put forth, a different possibility or alternative of how we can rebuild, different steps to take, and how peace consolidation can happen in an inclusive way, shying away from the traditional sense that is top bottom state building approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noura, for sharing those reflections and really outlining this point that there's no sort of the days of this externally imposed or ideologically driven cookie cutter type of approach. Well, I'm not sure those days ever really were particularly successful, but you've certainly highlighted some alternatives in terms of being grounded in more of a reparative justice approach, not necessarily looking to return to what a country context was pre-war, but using it as an opportunity to reimagine, renew, and reconcile. But also this point around what marks a shift between that, and I think Dean mentioned this as well, right? Like there's no clean transition necessarily from a conflict phase to a post-conflict phase at the moment, and certainly a number of contexts in the region point to that. Very curious and very keen to hear from our third speaker, Zuzan Alouche, who was in Damascus earlier this week, and in a context where many of these questions are taking on a particular urgency, a particular sense of relevance and importance, and where they're manifesting in a way where it's really a critical juncture for Syria, but also for the region. So yeah, very keen to hear from you, Suzanne, about your perspectives on some of the questions that Dean and Noura have also responded to.
Yeah, hi. I will be speaking in Arabic.
So
maybe you have time to change. Yeah. Okay. So شكرا كثير أليكس.
Thank you, Alex. شكرا لأن أكون في هذا الويبينار وشكرا and thank you for the first speakers. I'm sorry for the noise because I am at a forum. I found no quite a I have returned from Syria because I had a trip there. It was a very painful trip. The reconstruction in Syria is worse than you can imagine and than any report that you can read. The infrastructure has been destroyed. Complete cities have been destroyed, and people didn't know their houses, and people didn't know their spaces. People are displaced, and some are in their houses. I'm returning with quite a pain from Syria. I'll highlight 2 points according to what the previous speakers have stated. I have a certain method about reconstruction regarding justice, infrastructure, and other. But today in Syria, the situation enforces 2 points about reconstruction. We will have reconstruction with an attracting investment. The reconstruction would be focused in certain areas that were there before war. There won't be any informed and thorough decentralized reconstruction in the areas that need reconstruction and development, the areas that need life. We don't have this approach now. And having seen it in my meetings with the businessmen and those who are working in the reconstruction, I have met with those who work in the sections, and there isn't any approach about integrated reconstruction. At least this is what I have seen. With the meetings with countries that have interest in Syria, there isn't any concept or will of a reconstruction that has income. It is just the strategic reconstruction, strategic investments on the airports and ports, the oil, the sites that were quite strategic before. The international community with the capitals that entering Syria for reconstruction, they say they would focus on the attracting investments. It may not be quite an income, but it has a strategic and political interest. The second point, most of those working in reconstruction, they would request information and data. There isn't any data in Syria. The data in Syria has been controlled by the intelligence. NGOs one way and other would just satisfy those intelligence people and get the data. There is no data to work on. The data collection mechanism would be monopolized by UNDP and the agencies that are affiliated to UN. The major problem today in Syria and the concern is that we have the data that we work the reconstruction from is the data that had been used before the war. There won't be any real data from Syria. The data that we collected would pave the way for unjust reconstruction. The question is, would there be an approach of decentralized reconstruction? Because today in Syria, 50% of the lands are not under the control of the current authority. If we work with the civil society and the international community, with the local international capitals, we can push for a decentralized reconstruction. This way will give a bigger role for the localities in implementation. And this way we can create a committee, central one, for planning reconstruction. There wasn't any such an approach before, and we said that what we have agreed that the planning and the thinking should be centralized. This way, there isn't any role for the localities. The capitals entering Syria for the reconstruction, it is a Saudi capitals, could be Turkish companies, could be Qatari companies, could be from US and UK. There is a consensus today that they have to be seen, that they would come with their experts and companies and they would implement the reconstruction plans. Their will to exist and to be present in Syria for institutional and political agendas is quite clear for all the capitals that are thinking for reconstruction in Syria. We need to neutralize localities and the capitals. This could work job opportunities, but not big ones. This way, we will have injustice in the implementation, justice in job opportunities for people. These are the three things I have seen in Damascus and other areas. The centralization in Aleppo and Damascus. The last point I would like to highlight is the contradicting data. There is a reconstruction company from UAE. They don't want anyone to collect data from. They want to collect data themselves. You might have experts. You can do, you can mix between your work and the local work. These companies, they want to depend on their own data. I will give an example on this. In one of the areas that we visited, there are some buildings, Turkey and Qatari supported companies. Under the building, there is water suitable for drinking. There is underground water. How have you constructed these buildings? No answer. Who did the assessment? No answer. How did you come to build on these wells? People are thirsty. Right under the buildings, there is a source of water. The people in the building said that they have been trying just to stop this water, but they couldn't. It's a water like for drinking. it is called a reconstruction plan, but it did not consider the underground wells and the environment and other. There are some empty houses, but they are away from the center. There are some. There is also a building has been reconstructed in the time of Al-Assad. How can you build such a thing without infrastructure? In the local level, they have not assessed the needs for reconstruction. Now, one way or another, we will push that reconstruction should be localized, or at least decentralized, built on certain areas that meet the needs and the environmental settings. At the same time, there have to be a central plan or a general authority that pushes that reconstruction should be implemented in all the places, not only the strategic or political milestones. We have met so many people and all were interested in milestones that were important before the war. There were so many recommendations regarding reconstruction. Fortunately, there is a group working on the policies of reconstruction. There are so many ideas. I'll stop here, but the main outcome was that there was a good common ground in Syria that we can build upon, but we can work on it with UNDP and the previous government. We can work on this so that we come up with a new vision that could be presented to the donors. We can give some jurisdictions and some power authorities to the localities. We can also learn from experiences from Iraq, for example, when they make all UN agencies are coordinators only. I'll not talk about the policy or the politics. We have studied also Sri Lanka's experience, which has failed in reconstruction. I'll stop here and I'll say that this is the reality in Syria. Complementation between the research and the implementation is important, but the tragic situation in Syria won't make the implementation perfect, but there are some things we can work on given the current situation. I have finished. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for really a very comprehensive analysis and snapshot of the current dynamics unfolding in Syria at the moment in relation to these questions. I also see that there's at least one question has kicked us off in the chat, but before we turn over to any questions participants may have, I wanted to abuse the moderator's chair to ask one additional question to each of you, really trying to connect some of the different threads that each of you have mentioned, and I think what is quite a complementary set of reflections and remarks. So first, for Noura, Suzanne mentioned a little bit now some of the interplay and considerations in relation to inclusion and inclusivity and so on. And I know you've done a lot of work around the interplay between foreign direct investment, gender rights, particularly in post-conflict settings. How do you sort of see some of these points Zuzan mentioned around strategic investments as opposed to social investments and social infrastructure and so on? And based on your research and experience from other contexts in the region and more broadly, what are some key issues in relation to the interconnection between FDI, gender rights, in post-conflict settings that we should be mindful of, essentially, going forward, not just in relation to Syria's immediate future, but also looking elsewhere in the region? So that would be for you, Noura. For Dean, I have a question around, given Noura's point around, the multilateral system is waning, perhaps, to put it mildly. In that context, how do you see the linkages between the prospects of inclusive reconstruction and sort of partial or incomplete peacemaking processes? How can the peace processes that do exist do a better job of trying to address questions around reconstruction? And for Zuzan, I had an additional question around the linkages and how it's currently playing out. You mentioned a number of initiatives in relation to reconstruction, both from individual, in relation to individual sectors or strategic investments. But how are those conversations being linked to initiatives and spaces in relation to the current political transition in Syria? Just yesterday, the National Dialogue Conference concluded. It concluded with an 18-point agenda. There were some points that sort of spoke to economic recovery, but very few actually mentioned anything around reconstruction. So how do you sort of see the intersection between these different issues? Perhaps first to Noura and then Dean and Zuzan.
Thank you, Alex, for the question. I'll try to be brief, although it's a loaded question. With the research that I've done, I was hypothesizing first that post-conflict, there's a window due to foreign direct investment that women can take advantage of to make sure that they are in the process, the decision-making table, that they are that their rights are being addressed in the reforms that are being done constitutionally and institutionally. So I looked at, with foreign direct investment, they usually have a lot of conditions, right? Conditions for the country itself to uphold certain norms depending on the foreign direct investment that's coming in. So usually if it's, let's say, for the lack of a better phrase, Western investment, then there are certain norms that need to be upheld within the receiver country, right? So usually what the countries do, the winning faction or the new government or what have you, usually always does write a beautifully reformed constitution that is inclusive and gives women their rights politically, socially, and all of that. But then I studied, I looked at observations like after the first election cycle, second election cycle, and third, if really that implementation or this window is being implemented and seen on ground. And the first elections, not really. After the second elections, you see a higher number of women that are in office, but then this does not translate, third and fourth elections, does not translate into more progressive norms, institutions, and all that towards women and gender. So then there is a gap between the understanding and the let's say the motive of the foreign direct investment that's coming in the country and whatever the faction that is in power at this stage, and its motive for taking that money, and does it really want to uphold greater women's rights or not. But with what Zuzan was saying, it echoes exactly what we were talking about, the importance of decentralizing that. Because she's worrying, she's like, I'm worried that we're going back to exactly what it was pre the reconstruction, right? So money's going to the same places. But what I was suggesting with the foreign direct investment is really a bridge with localized entrepreneurs and local small and mid and medium-sized businesses to really localize those solutions, and that money can be funneled where it needs to be funneled, basically. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. So yeah, the point that there's no easy fix, but there is the potential. I mean, there's critical windows of opportunity from the outset, but then really looking towards sort of more localized, subnational entry points and opportunities. Dean, yeah, what are your perspectives on the question I tabled, but also just listening to some of the reflections from Suzanne and Nura?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important and complex point in terms of where is multilateralism at this point. I mean, I still think that multilateral institutions, particularly when it comes to its normative role, has a very key place, which is the point I've stretched, but also, you know, in some programmatic roles because of many of the challenges that Zoltan so eloquently pointed out. You know, when you've got a state that's been completely decimated, you need sources of support that are institutional structural. And one of the conversations that I've been desperately trying to push as well is that even at an Arab regional level, the linking up of reconstruction discussions in Palestine, in Syria, in Sudan, in Lebanon, to get some of these lessons learned, because it is a very fragmented. We speak for good reason about bottom-up, inclusive and localization, but we must not overemphasize those points. The importance of international solidarity, of regional connections is, in my view at least, is still vitally important. And even in this incredibly strained multilateral context, there is still a valid place for multilateral principles around reconstruction to be laid out to guide, you know, where we are and where we want to go. And absolutely at the regional level, I think there's an even easier case to be made that architects, urban planners, academics, policymakers in contexts that really require mass reconstruction, there's a lot of cross-learning, solidarity, and strengthening that can be done across borders.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And to Suzanne, the question around the linkages between these reconstruction conversations or initiatives and some of the political transition processes, including the national dialogue.
Yeah. هلا انا رح احكي بالوضع السوري يعني مباشره لانه
I will be speaking about the context in Syria because I know some people are interested in the Rwanda experience. The issue today in Syria with regard to reconstruction. In 2010, an American bank was requested to work in Syria to develop the banking system. The issue was that Syria was uniquely a country that doesn't support the mortgage system. There are no debts between the population and the banks. People own their lands. This issue was crucial in the reconstruction context. In general, the land of the people are owned by the people. So we have already crossed this mile. There are huge Syrian capitals. For example, I am from the Kobani citizen. The Kobani relied 99% on the diaspora funds on the reconstruction. The Kurdi regions, the Arab regions, all rely on the diaspora of the people who are relocated to Saudi Arabia in the Gulf area. until today, some of these regions are actively producing values. The only one region, that's the Sahel area, is deprived from this fund. This is a reality in Syria. The land is owned by the Syrians. You can have local investors. This can help us to leverage the context. The second point is about gender. Portugal has a magnificent experience about woman-friendly spaces, and they created woman-friendly cities. Today, we need to think about the significant number of widows. A lot of women disappeared, a lot of men disappeared, a lot of men died. So we need to consider the legal conflict and the constitutional conflict that does not allow the woman widow to take care of her family and have a decision in the property. The third point, which is also important, is the language of victory. The language of victory is controlling the discourse about reconstruction. You would hear things like, it's we who destroyed the Assad regime, it is we who did this and that. This is a very high, very common discourse. I have a concern that the issue of the gender would be very difficult to integrate in the reconstruction efforts. Finally, the ethnic affiliations and how would it affect the context of reconstruction. Some communities have grievances against other communities, which would affect eventually the sustainable peace in Syria. These were the points I wanted to raise in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Susan. I think the points that really stuck out to me is the fact that society has fundamentally changed as a result of 12, 13, 14 years of conflict. It no longer looks the same. The legal frameworks that then enable or facilitate inclusive reconstruction also then need to adapt accordingly. And yeah, you also highlighted the key role that the diaspora can potentially play in direct, very concrete reconstruction efforts as well. There's a couple of questions coming in to the chat, which is great. The first one from Hulla, apologies if I mispronounce your name. If a strong administration is formed, wars and migration can be prevented, but how this process will be carried out is very important, and what should be kept in the foreground. What can non-governmental organizations do in this process? So what are some real priorities for the moment, and what can NGOs and other actors do? It would be great to hear perspectives from all three of you. I think the second question from Mehmet around how do bottom-up and top-down approaches to post-conflict reconstruction differently impact the social, cultural, and economic structures of cities? What lessons can be drawn from experiences around the world? Perhaps that's leaning more towards, Dean, your areas of expertise around reconstruction as violence and the urbanization of conflict and so on. So if you could add that to your response as well. Perhaps over to Dr. Noura to kick us off for the Q&A, and then Zuzan, and then Dean, if you're amenable to that proposal.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions. So with the proposal that I put forth earlier about reparative justice and having a localized, decentralized solution to each country, that's where non-governmental organizations come in. They have a big role because they have a unique or a niche element where they are embedded within local society, right? Within the factions, they understand the makeup of cultural nuances and what's going on. So this, yes, there is a formal, centralized, strong administrative reforms or what have you, but then to really bring it home, have longevity, and make sure you are dealing with grievances and to avoid all harm that has been done. NGOs, civil societies have a very big role to play because they have a contextualized impact with locals, understanding the nuances. So absolutely, like this is important. What comes first? I think this really depends on the case that we're talking about. It depends on, to what extent, what phase are we in the rebuilding or post-conflict of each country, and what is the role of civil society, if any? Is there a role there? Has the constitution prior given space for that? And the types of NGOs. But usually civil society and NGOs really bring the localized, decentralized context that have people really get over their trauma, basically.
Thank you, Noura. Suzanne, what's your perspective on that first question?
Okay, 1 minute. So now, بناء أنا رح أعلق على موضوع
I'll comment on the sectarian and ideological aspect of the topic. With all due respect to all tendencies in Syria because of the exclusion, but there is a clear picture. There is a clear narrative controlling a category of Syria, the victorious category. We have a concern that this would affect all the reconciliation processes, the transitional justice, and the formation of any administration or government in the coming time, and on the reconstruction and the reparations and other. These are very important points in Syria today. There is negligence. There is stereotyping that 17 million were living under Assad, and that all they were affiliated with Assad. This is very dangerous. As regards to the reconstruction and investment. Thus, there is persistent insistence that there have to be a decentralized system in Syria. I was dealing with the past. It's impossible for us to reach sustainable peace or secure investment reconstruction without going through the natural phases. We cannot go to reconstruction without healing, without completing the healing, which is an important step after the conflict. We cannot go directly to reconstruction. The conflict has not ended yet. So reconstruction won't be as planned. What is the entry point? We have to work on rehabilitating on and healing. we have to rely on localities so that we avoid politicization or idealization of reconstruction after 2 years after the political process. Without these steps, we cannot go towards a sustainable peace that will bring change in Syria. And so we be realistic that after conflict there would be compromises and would be bad things and good things. We know this and we are realistic about this. But in total, if we put reasonable, realistic rules, with time we can reach sustainable process. Now we are putting now a general authority for reconstruction without knowing the situation of the areas not affiliated to the central government. We cannot do reconstruction not ideologized or politicized. This is very important to consider. I would like to focus on the necessity, the importance of integrating localities in any process we do anywhere in the world. If these localities are not taken into consideration, they will return to be vandalizing actors. Lebanon and Gaza are given examples. And we have seen that the Oslo agreement, the authority have agreed without Hamas. In Lebanon also, in the conference, they're now talking about unifying the terms and the concepts regarding the decentralization and roles. All this will impact the reconstruction, and all won't be able to join the reconstruction. When addressing this, the reconstruction process would be appropriate. Without this, anyone involving in reconstruction would be not effective or would be vandalizing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Susan. I think there's a number of
important
points there that are worth revisiting. I also see there's other questions coming through, but Dean, first over to you to respond to the first two questions, and then we can try to squeeze in the next two, because I know there's a lot of interest to continue the conversation. But Dean, over to you first.
Just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on Mehmet's question because I think it's a particularly important one in relation to my own expertise.
Sure.
I just wanted to, because the question of bottom-up and top-down approaches in relation to reconstruction is a really important one, because, and as Alison was also touching upon, you know, the broad contempt there is across many Arab governments for their own populations, that just ignore them in terms of urban design process. And you see the weaknesses of municipalities also throughout the region, and that consultation between the population and how urban development happens, the new capital in Cairo being a great example. And this kind of top-down mass urban development makes you often get trapped in saying, we have to do bottom-up, we have to do bottom-up. When it comes to urban context, there are some things that have to be top-down. You cannot build a sewage system from the bottom up. It's always a great example. And go to any city and look at their sewage system. It will tell you how strong their governance is. And, you know, transport systems and so on, they cannot be planned from the bottom. There has to be some bottom-up approaches and some top-down. And it's that in how you do it and those interrelationships. And equally, bottom-up processes can be done well, and they can be done incredibly badly. So it's not just bottom up is good, top down is bad. There has to be a sophistication in what is being considered to be top down and bottom up, and how it's being implemented, and what is being done, which gets back to that original point around the importance of principles and multilateral frameworks and the sharing of information of best practice.
Great. And I think that actually ties into some of the points Suzanne made around sort of the intersections between reconstruction and political transition processes as well, in terms of who is included in what space and how that also translates and sets parameters for inclusion in reconstruction processes and this kind of thing. But yeah, very good point, which I think in the context that there's been a lot of emphasis on localized approaches and processes, but marrying those top-down and bottom-up processes and stakeholders and so on it's an important nuance. We have about 14 minutes left, so I do think I'm always a time optimist, so I do think we have a bit of time to engage in the next set of questions, and they are somehow interconnected, I think, at least in my reading. Christopher has asked a question around the relationship to land and how that can be more front and center in considerations around reconstruction. And so it's not necessarily just about these strategic investments, which we've talked a bit about today, but more about ownership, identity, and connection to land. So it would be great to hear colleagues' perspectives on that. And I think that that's somehow one side of, or it's quite complementary to Mehmet's second question, which is around post-conflict situations. How can cultural heritage be used as a tool for reconciliation and peace processes? I'm not sure if there's a volunteer of the speakers who would like to go first. Otherwise, perhaps we could go in reverse order. Start with Dean, and then to Suzanne, and then a final word to Noura.
Just to start on, cultural heritage has often been used as a tool for reconciliation. Obviously, the Mostar Bridge being a very famous one with the dissolving of Yugoslavia and that conflict in the 90s. And it can be done in a way that is responsive to the population and good. I would just make the additional point that maybe not answering your question, but I think it's an important one in cultural heritage, that we've seen it in Syria with Palmyra and so on, with cultural heritage sites becoming very prominent and used as examples in the conflict, because to a certain extent it captures the international imagination and attention. But I wouldn't disintegrate, or I'd like to highlight the significance of everyday urban spaces, of schools, offices, homes, and how their reconstruction rehabilitation must always be prioritized, because these are the spaces that matter most to those who've been impacted by conflict. Ideally, of course, it doesn't detract from cultural heritage, but in the case of scarce resources, I think more of an emphasis by practitioners and professionals in the policy-making space must be placed on everyday urban spaces and how we can ensure that they are used as tools for the reconciliation and peace and inserted into peace processes.
Thanks, Dean. Did you want to come in on this point around land and identity as well?
Yeah, well, where to start? I mean, it's a hugely complex question, and also the points that of the scale it says in terms of placing the control of the hands and people developing ports and oil wells that are extractive and exploitative relationships to land. Again, there needs to be a careful balance here. In ports are also absolutely critical for reconstruction. These are not just extractive sites. If you want to get rubble out, concrete, steel rebars in, you need functioning ports, and you need that kind of infrastructure. And if I'm understanding the question right, again, it all gets down to a question of local governance and that respect for people to enable their opinions and reflections to be heard in the way reconstruction happens. That's easier said than done in conflict, often protracted conflict contexts. But that doesn't mean that I don't have hope that it can be done. It just needs contexts and approaches that are sensitive to places that are being engaged.
Thank you for those perspectives. Suzanne, what's your take on these questions around cultural heritage as a tool for reconciliation and peace processes? Also keeping in mind what you mentioned about the politicization of reconstruction efforts that's already very apparent in the last few months in Syria.
هلا اول شيء بما يخص الموضوع الاثار يعني جزء منها
concerning the cultural heritage, some of our heritage got lost.
نظام الأسد already قضى على بعضها.
The Assad regime took control of our heritage in the southern regions, in Halab, Rif al-Ain. We still have some cultural heritage. It is normal that the issue is taking some attention, and the conflict has affected the heritage significantly.
ولا هي الآثار اللي هي من بقايا الحرب؟ آثار الحرب.
What was the question? You were asking about the cultural heritage. Yes. I will take this at the micro level. I'm not saying that the localities should be taking care of their own cultural heritage. Of course, we need to have a central plan to distribute the investment and the reconstruction and everything. But my focus is that the localities need to have a role in re-engineering their needs and make the priorities they think they need to focus on. We don't have strong examples of decentralized processes of rehabilitation. But, for example, let us say that the cultural heritage create revenues go to the central government, and the central government deprive the communities from these revenues. Why would I care about this? If I don't have access to the revenues, if I'm not benefiting from them, and this applies to the reconstruction, why would I get concerned about the rehabilitation and reconstruction if I am not part of it. The localities in Syria, they didn't have any access to revenues. The resources that have been stolen, according to some reports of
طيب إذا كان في جزء من هذه الموارد لمدينة
3/3 of the revenues that should go to the state were stolen.
ولكن إذا كانت كل شيء سيذهب إلى المركز,
if everything goes to the central government,
غير شرعية لحتى أنا لا
of course I would think as a locality to find ways, even if these ways are illegal, to benefit from the cultural heritage. Tadmur, Alex, there is no interest at all for preserving the cultural heritage, and this is all caused by the corruption and the stealing of the revenues. Consequently, in the future, if we have any investment, if we have any plans for the cultural heritage, we need to think about the revenues for the localities. Otherwise, it would not work. Secondly, centralization of the reconstruction efforts around the water, and we know that the water war is a significant element. Between us and the Furat River is 10 kilometers. We didn't have access to investment license. However, in Elob, there were reconstruction and construction projects, and the license is always given based on your political affiliation. What I want to say is that the localities should have a role. They should have access to the revenues. Otherwise, we will go back to the same old policies of the Assad regime, which eventually destructed Syria. I wanted to say to you that I'm not talking about chaos, but about participation of localities in the planning and the implementation. That's my point.
Yeah, no, and that's very clear, and I think it builds on previous reflections you've shared as well. Noura?
Real quick, just to respond to the extractive and oil industry and all that. So when we look at the foreign direct investment, we can broadly, like generally, just break it into brownfield and greenfield. So greenfield is usually money coming in to rebuild, bridges, roads, malls, and what have you, right? And then the brownfield is usually the extractive. So extractive activities based on the country and what natural resources it has. The way we can look at the conflict in the Middle East, we need to look at the rise of regional powers and what is the makeup of the foreign direct investment that is coming. So basically, I'm tying this to the pan-Arab and Arab identity, Arab self-determinism. So we see money that is coming in from other Arab countries. So then the makeup of reconstruction would be, we can observe it to be somewhat differently. Like Suzanne talked about Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, like there are regional powers that are wanting to invest in. So in this sense, because they have a link to the Arab identity in general, then we should see some reflection within the identity of Syria, of Lebanon, or what have you, that is still has a link to the population itself. So let's observe what regional powers do. And of course, I'm not romanticizing that idea. It's very complex and it's based on interest, right? Like, Saudi's interest, Qatar interest, and what is it that they want to, put forth within the country. But silver lining, we're just saying that a lot of the money is coming from other Arab countries. So we can see in the future an identity that would be still intact. That is a Syrian identity. That is a Lebanese identity because of where the money is coming from, basically.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And thank you to all the three speakers and to the colleagues for joining online. It's very clear that 90 minutes is only enough to really scratch the surface or begin to scratch the surface on some of these questions. And I think we could have easily gone for 90 more minutes, although questions around sustenance and whether that would be a fair thing to do to anyone can be discussed. But just to say, I think a few key messages really resonated with me. This point around political transitions are inherently contested, especially in contexts like Syria, like Sudan, like Palestine, like Lebanon, where many of these processes are incomplete or partial. As a result, reconstruction is also incredibly contested, and some of the parameters that shape political transition processes also shape reconstruction and vice versa. But also this point, and I think all three of you made it very much more eloquently than I could, that there's a lot more to unpack here that conversations like this can really help shed light on, bringing together perspectives from across the region and beyond, drawing on comparative experiences from elsewhere, which I think a couple of colleagues mentioned, and this intersection or bridge between research, practice, and policy and so on, whether that's at regional level or multilateral level and so on. So as I mentioned, we will put a blog out that tries to get our head around and more articulately present some of these ideas. But yeah, just to say a huge thanks to the three speakers, Dr. Noura Chouaibi, Zozan Alouche, and Dr. Din Sharp. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your perspectives and experience with us all. Thanks also to the participants for joining. Thanks to the colleagues on the Inclusive Peace side for doing all the hard work getting us here. As I mentioned, please follow our LinkedIn where we'll post the blog. We'll also post the recording. And finally, last but not least, wishing a blessed Ramadan to all those observing over the next month or so. And yeah, keep a lookout because we're really keen to continue these types of spaces, discussing these kinds of issues over the coming months as well. So thanks a lot, everyone. And I think we'll close the webinar right now.